scientific tafsir is a part of, that outlook was began to be systematically voiced and expressed by Muslim thinkers in the second half of the 19th century. And it's kind of interesting that just as there were parallel manifestations of this idea of Islamic movement in the Indian subcontinent and in Egypt, with Maududi and Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb, similarly, about a century before that, you had the foremost proponents of the ideas of accommodating European rationalism based on the Enlightenment. You had, in the Indian subcontinent, you had Sayyid Ahmad Khan proposing these ideas, and in Egypt, you had Muhammad Abdu. And both of them had contributions to make with regard to tafsir. Although Sayyid Ahmad Khan didn't write a tafsir per se, he did write a treatise, a short essay, on the principles of tafsir. And some of those principles were expressed and practically in a journal that he edited called Tahdib al-Akhlaq. Now, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, his whole career was really a reaction to the events of 1857, in which the Muslims tried to defeat the British militarily. The British had basically established political and military dominance over the Indian subcontinent, and there's this event that the British called the Great Mutiny of 1857. It ended in the defeat of the Indians, and those who had spearheaded that struggle on the Indian side were the Muslims. And so the Muslims were forced to then take stock of their situation. And so one of the prominent intellectuals who voiced the need for a new direction in dealing with the situation was Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Now, what he proposed was that the Muslims had to accommodate themselves with the British because they had failed in trying to defeat them militarily, so you have to play it as it lays, basically. And so he tried to convince the Muslims that they should put aside the idea of military opposition to the British, and he tried to convince the British that the Muslims were their friends. And he personally worked for the British authorities, and he tried to use his position to cut the best deal possible for the Muslims. And so he set up Aligarh University in order to train educated Muslims in the kind of knowledge that would make them employable in the British system. And so his institution was very influential for producing a modernist outlook among the Muslims, one that would accommodate itself to the world that was dominated by the British in particular and Europeans in general. Now, if we look at his principles of tafsir, the first thing he had to say, which is something that pretty much any Muslim would agree with, I think, is that the book of nature is authored by Allah, and the Qur'an is authored by Allah. It's his speech, and it reflects his knowledge. And therefore, because they have the same source, and Allah is all-knowing, there can be no real contradiction between the two. His second point, the Mu'tazilites would have been very comfortable and familiar with it, is that because Allah made reason the means by which his revelation can be understood, that there is nothing in the religion which is opposed to sound reason. And then his third point was that if there's a perceived contradiction between the Sharia texts and what is known to be true scientifically, then the problem is in interpretation of the texts, and that the way to resolve that is that we have to re-examine the text and understand that the literal meaning cannot be meant, and that there must be some kind of a metaphorical meaning there. Now, in taking that approach, although I didn't read his treatise personally, I only had access to a description of it. What I understood from the ideas that were summarized in that article were that he didn't seem to express the idea that the current state of scientific knowledge might be wrong. And this marks a real difference between his approach and that of later theoreticians of Islamization of knowledge, such as Ismail Farouqi, Taha Jabir Alwani. They said, well, if there's a perceived contradiction between what's scientific theory and something in the Qur'an, that the problem could be in our interpretation of natural phenomena, the theories that have been built to explain natural phenomena, or the problem could be in our interpretation of the text. So it's a bipolar approach. For Sayyid Ahmed Khan, it just seems to be a singular approach. The science of his time, he seems to accept it as just, that's truth. And so what happens is that, for instance, when Darwin published his theory on evolution, Ahmed Khan said, okay, well, that must be true. And he did his best to try to convince Muslims that it was true, which caused some Muslim scholars in the subcontinent to declare him a disbeliever. Now, one of the results of his methodology was that any mention of a miracle in the Qur'an, well, has to be explained away. Although he has precedent in it among the views of the Salaf, of course, for an event like Isra and Miraj, it couldn't possibly have happened physically. The Prophet ﷺ must have been, this was something that happened spiritually. So these kind of, it's an apologetic approach. And it's kind of quaint and sort of embarrassing in light of the fact that 19th century ideas of science, they're dated. So this brings us, eventually, it'll bring us to one of the criticisms of TAFSIIR al-ilmi, of the Qur'an in general. Now, if we look at Hamid Abdu, now he had a similar position. He didn't found an institution, but he ended up becoming the head of the foremost educational institution in Egypt, Al-Azhar, and he had similar reformist ideas about how Azhar should be changed to meet the challenges of the modern era. And although he didn't actually write a tafsir, he delivered lectures on tafsir, and one of his students, Muhammad Rashid Rida, of Syrian origin, he took notes, and he was so impressed with these lectures that he wrote his notes up, and he presented them to Abdu with the proposal that these be published. And so Abdu agreed, and Muhammad Rashid Rida, he would he would show Muhammad Abdu what he had written based upon the lectures that Abdu had delivered, and Abdu would make any necessary changes that he saw necessary, and then Rida published them. And this eventually turned into what was called TAFSIIR al-Manar. And Abdu died long before this tafsir was completed. So I believe he'd done commentary up to and into Surah An-Nisa. And then Hamid Rashid Rida carried on publishing tafsir in the spirit of Muhammad Abdu in his journal, Al-Manar, and he ended up also dying well before it was completed, and then I believe there was somebody else who finished it out in their name. Anyway, or upon the same basic principles. So Muhammad Abdu died in 1905. Sayyid Ahmed Khan, I believe he died in 1888 or 98, little before that. Now, Abdu, he had some suggestions about, what is the role of a mufassir, that they should place themselves at the service of God's enlightening guidance, and first of all, should concentrate their efforts on searching the Quranic text to uncover Allah's signs in nature. So that's in line very much with scientific tafsir. And then they should discern the moral and legal norms of which the text speaks. They should not digress into complicated scholarly discussions about the possible senses of individual words and phrases, nor should they immerse themselves in a variety of levels of meaning, whether grammatical or mystical, that might be discernible in the text, particularly since these various understandings were quite unfamiliar to the Arabs of the Prophet's time. And then he put this stress that the text has to be understood first in terms of how it was understood by those who were the initial audience for it, the Sahaba. One of the points that he stresses is that whatever has been left indefinite in the Qur'an should be left indefinite. Don't waste time trying to find out the name of this or that individual or that tree or that dog or whatever. And don't try to fill in what's been left out of Quranic narratives by looking at Israeliyat and various narratives that are of doubtful origin. The earlier generations of scholars handed them down, but there's all these kind of elements in them which are opposed to reason, they're irrational. So then he also, he just stresses that rational aspect. Islam is a rational religion. It's consistent with rationalism. It has a positive attitude towards science and superstitious beliefs among the masses. These are a deviation from its teaching, and it's important that these kind of misunderstandings be cleared up. And whatever he considers to be superstitious. And if there's any doubt about the meaning of something in the text, then science is the criterion by which the meanings of Quranic wordings must be understood. And so he has, these attempts, which are referred to in Dr. Phillips' book. He tries to interpret the jinn as being somehow a reference to microbes, and that in Surah Fil, that the flocks of birds, which they're mentioned to have thrown stones down, that actually they're flies, and that their polluted legs had transmitted a disease to Ashab al-Fil, and that was what caused their destruction.